Hi, I'm Tacsh. When your teacher tells you to go read a classic piece of literature and you Google the shortest classic ever written, you will find this. This small poem is Ozymandias. It's so short that just by looking at the thumbnail of this video, you have already read most of it. It only consists of a few lines, but in those few lines, there are themes of pride and legacy. Or it would be better to say that it's about the futility of legacy. But before we dive into the poem, I want to talk about the man who wrote it, because I feel like he was equally as interesting as the poem itself. It was written by Percy Shelley. And if you pricked up after hearing that name, yes, he is the husband of Mary Shelley, the woman who wrote Frankenstein. But Percy isn't just the husband of Mary Shelley, he was quite the acclaimed poet himself. In fact, he's one of the most famous romantic poets of all time. Although, like most great authors, he did not achieve this level of notoriety in his lifetime. At that time, he was just a weirdo writing words on a page. But after his death, his poetry was read and influenced some pretty famous people like Robert Browning, Yeats, Thomas Hardy. His poetry has been studied in schools and colleges. In fact, you might be familiar with some of his poems yourself. Ode to the West Wind, Mont Blanc, not the really expensive pen, but like the poem. No? Okay, my bad. Percy Shelley was born on August 4th, 1792 in Sussex, England. His father... Hi, this is Editing Rio. You might be wondering what I'm doing here. Well, that's because I called Percy's father, Timothy Shelley, Thomas Shelby throughout the entire video. This goof was caused because me and my friends were talking about Thomas Shelby from Peaky Blinders right before recording. So whenever I say Thomas Shelby, just remember it's Timothy, okay? My bad, this one's on me. Back to the video. Thomas Shelby was a wealthy landowner and his mother was the daughter of a successful butcher. Fair to say that our boy was born into money. At the age of 6, he was sent to school where it became immediately obvious that he was something special. He had a gift for language. However, he was bullied a lot. In college, there would be group bullying sessions of Percy, which people apparently called Percy bait. The reason it's called this is because Percy would respond to bullying with violent outbursts, even earning himself the name Mad Percy. Now, the reason he was bullied was because he was very nonconformist and he wouldn't take part in I don't think I can say that word, bruh. If we just replace the F here with an R, we would get the word ragging, which basically means the same thing, so that's what I'm gonna call it, okay? It's basically seniors bullying their juniors and making them do weird stuff like dancing, singing, frog jumps, etc, etc. You know, the usual, bullying children because their parents change the subject anytime they're brought up. It was at school he became interested in occult rituals and he would begin reading romance and supernatural stories. He was a voracious reader and deeply interested in science. This interest in science also may have caused him to have some atheistic views. Along with science, he also became quite interested in idealist philosophy. I want you to keep this in mind, I'll get back to it much later. Percy eventually made it to Oxford University, a university so famous that it literally needs no introduction. Most of the students at Oxford would slave away studying or attending lectures, but Percy would pursue poetry. Now, you remember how I told you he had atheistic views, right? You know how this is 1810s England? Do you know what else was happening around this time? This guy. Because of the Napoleonic Wars, there was tension between Britain and France. During this time, religion, especially Christianity, was a very volatile topic. It was seen as a national symbol, and Oxford University, being the single greatest university in Britain, was supposed to exemplify the ideal British scholar. Intelligent, gentlemanly, and most importantly, Christian. So guess what our boy did? He wrote highly political poems and essays with atheistic themes. In fact, it was literally called The Necessity of Atheism. I just don't want to say that you're sorry for now, girl. Cause I just want to say for me to... Yeah, so this wombo combo of events led him to getting expelled from Oxford University. Thomas Shelby was not exactly thrilled to hear his son was kicked out of the most prestigious university in the world and demanded that if he didn't return home to study under a tutor, he would be disowned. Percy refused to go back, and this led to a falling out with his father. A little later, he met Harriet Westbrook, and even though Percy was strongly ideologically opposed to marriage, he married her on 28th of August, 1811. This is where William Godwin, an idol to Percy, advised him to reconcile with his father and to become a scholar before he published anything else. After this, Percy goes to Ireland in hopes of agitating the political climate there. Yeah, the dude just does stuff like this. Anyway, Harriet gave birth to their daughter, but Harriet and Percy's relationship deteriorated. to the extent where they now lived apart, basically divorced in all but name. During a time like this, he went to visit his mentor William Godwin, where he met Mary Godwin, his daughter, and fell in love with her, eloping with her in July of 1814. This burned his bridge with William Godwin too, because who knew that running away with a guy's daughter and basically making her a harlot in the eyes of the public would piss him off. 2 years after this, Mary Godwin became Mary Shelley. Remember that Percy had a problem with marriage, right? But here he is, doing it again. Now you might think of Percy as a raging, selfish hypocrite, but this marriage was actually quite tactical. See, he married her because he wanted to clear Mary's name by making her his official wife, and also because he wanted to be on talking terms with William Godwin again. This was also done so he could have custody of his children that he had with Harriet, because the courts apparently wouldn't give him custody without having a mother to support the children. Also because he may or may not have had a hand in the death of Mary's half-sister Fanny Imlay. Now, for obvious reasons, his marriage with Mary Shelley is the most heavily documented part of Percy's life. But I feel like it's better covered from the perspective of Mary Shelley. I'll eventually make a video on Frankenstein, so I'll cover it more there. However, to summarize how their marriage was, I'll just read out a quote that Mary wrote in her journal in 1819, 5 years after being together with Percy Shelley. "We have now lived 5 years together, and if all the events of the 5 years were blotted out, I might be happy." It should be clear that their marriage was not going well, and this period was probably the most painful in their relationship. This was about the time Percy wrote the piece Stanzas Written in Dejection near Naples. Percy is a man who writes poetry on what he feels at the time. In a way, every time he writes, it's about himself from his perspective. Less pieces of literature and more him just venting his thoughts out into the world. Which I think is why so many of his writings were never published when he was alive. So many of his most iconic works were stuffed away in the vault and published after he passed away. Right before his death, at only the age of 29, he wrote his final poem, titled The Triumph of Life. A tragic irony really, because he never got to finish it, the poem literally stopping in the middle of a sentence, just like his life. The poem, published after his death, however, perfectly wraps up the story of Percy Shelley. From the outside, this poem is a true romantic poem, describing the beauty of nature through a vision. But when you read deeper, you'll find lines such as this, and this. Only then do you realize that this is not a celebration of nature, but a tragedy, showing the loss of idealism in his life. Percy Shelley died at the age of 29 when he was on a boat during a storm. His corpse was washed up on the beach and was cremated. When he died, the papers reported on his death, mocking him, saying that now Percy, the atheist writer, will now get to find out if God was real or not. After his death, many of his poems were published, and as I've already told you in the intro, it influenced many great writers. When he was alive, he never found success as an author or a poet. It was only after his death that he was lauded as the greatest romantic poet of all time. But one thing always remained the same. Out of all his great works, there is one that is said to be his greatest, time and time again. And that poem is called Ozymandias. The poem is told from the perspective of an unnamed narrator, perhaps Shelley himself. He tells the story of how he met a traveler from an antique land. From the following text, we can pretty much guess that he's describing Egypt. This traveler describes a statue, worn and broken by the weather of the land. Now only 2 legs remain standing, with the torso completely missing. Nearby lies the head, its face stiff and resolute. The traveler says that you can really see the passion of the sculptor in the details in the face. On the pedestal on which the statue stood, these words were carved. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The concluding lines of the poem are not about the gravity of the statement, but about the loneliness of everything around it, about the sands that stretch into the horizon. When you first read it, it is really hard to decipher any meaning from the text. It's kind of like modern art where it looks like human feces, but it's actually human feces. Okay, maybe it's not like modern art, but you have to think about it for more than 5 seconds to understand this. This poem is about the great Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. He is undoubtedly the greatest pharaoh of all time. In fact, he was referred to as the great ancestor by all his descendants. And that name is not just for show either. He reigned for about 67 years. 68 minus 1 years. He had one of the longest reigns in history, living to his 90s. That's uncommon even now. You had to be built different to do that when people thought that a random cut you got was caused by a demonic entity. You would think that I'm making that up, but no, that was a very real thing. He led 15 military campaigns against his enemies and won every single one of them. Then he would build monuments and pieces of art as propaganda, depicting his victory over them. He was quite famous for building monuments actually. You could find many statues of himself everywhere, and even temples would be transformed in his image, quite literally transforming him into a god. Back then, pharaohs would commission engraved artwork of themselves on stone. However, these carvings would easily be changed by their successors by simply carving over them. Ramesses II knew this, so what he did was make sure that his carvings were deeply engraved into the stone to make sure that no other pharaoh could erase his presence from history. Just by this, you can probably tell that Ramesses II was a man who was deeply concerned about legacy, wanting something to carry on his name after his death. Now, you might be thinking, if this guy's name is Ramesses II, why does the statue call itself Ozymandias? Was it making a Breaking Bad reference? The name Ozymandias is itself just the Greek name of Ramesses II. Percy probably discovered this name while he was reading a Greek biography of the king. In fact, that is probably where he learned about Ramesses II in the first place. What's really cool about this is that I think we can find out the exact statue that is talked about in this poem. During his reign, he made a colossal statue of himself that was about 11 meters in length and weighed about 75 tons. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek scholar of Egyptian history, even said that on the base of the statue was written these lines: "King of kings, Ozymandias am I. If any want to know how great I am and where I lie, let him outdo me in my work." Which is almost word for word the lines written in Ozymandias on the base of the statue. In fact, we can basically assume that this is the very statue that Ozymandias is talking about, or at least another version of the statue, assuming Ramesses II made many of these statues around his kingdom. And the traveler in the poem who went to the antique land is none other than Diodorus Siculus himself. Percy saying that he met a traveler is basically him reading Diodorus's book. In the poem, Percy is almost mocking Ozymandias for thinking that he could conserve his legacy through the description of the statue. Like, think about it. The only thing that is still standing relatively intact are his feet. You know, the thing that's supposed to support his figure. His torso is entirely missing. It's implied that it's buried beneath the sand. The head of the statue is on the ground, like he had literally been beheaded. On the face that was so expertly crafted to display the power and pride of the pharaoh, there is a crack running through it, literally shattering his pride. What I want you to notice is what the traveler talks about after describing the statue. It's not about the power of the pharaoh, but simply appreciation for the artist's skill. Keep this point in mind, it'll be important in a few minutes. On the pedestal, there is a quote of Ozymandias boasting about his power and the strength of his kingdom, which ironically contrasts with the sand stretching into infinity surrounding the statue. I've already told you how powerful King Ramesses II was. To his subject, the pharaoh Ozymandias really was the closest thing to God. Not only did he conquer his enemies and destroy their morale, giving them PTSD every time his statue was seen, but his empire was thriving solely because of him. What I'm trying to say is that when the statue was originally sculpted, this line was not that far off from reality. He was a mighty tyrant, but he wasn't a god. The kingdom that he fought so hard for is now dust. The only thing that remains of his power and his name that was once known by all is a broken statue. I mean, Percy wasn't even being subtle here. The lines, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," are literally followed up by "nothing beside remains." That's as subtle as a clown at a funeral. Like, what are we doing here? These lines being placed right next to each other makes Ozymandias almost look like a fool for being naive enough to think that his name would last forever. The haunting part is the double meaning of "look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." Should we look on his works and despair because he's the most powerful man in the world? Or should we despair because if the most powerful pharaoh of all time was reduced to this, what are we going to do? His visage is shattered, but it still remains even if it is in a pathetic state. But think about all the bodies below those lone and level sands that have been completely erased by time. That's a pretty nihilistic thought for a man who studied idealist philosophy. Now, this is where I want to talk to you about the idea of romanticism. This was a cultural moment that was happening during the time Percy was writing. Contrary to popular belief, romanticism wasn't about doing freaky things with others. No. It was about doing freaky things with nature. Instead of talking about the shape of the lips of a lover, you talk about the shape of a cloud or the smell of a tree or the texture of grass. The prime example of this would be William Wordsworth. And if you don't know who that is, ask your mom. That has worked too many times for it not to be a coincidence. Percy Shelley lived during this era and was undoubtedly a romantic poet. One only needs to read a few lines of Mont Blanc to understand that. See, romanticism isn't just about the beauty of nature, but humanity's attempt to dominate it. When I was reading Ozymandias for the first time, I couldn't comprehend how it tied into the Romantic era, but with this thought in mind, we can tell that Ozymandias is essentially a romantic poem. This poem is about how a man's legacy was slowly chipped away by sand. It's about humanity's impotence compared to the natural world. Ozymandias is a nature poem. Think about the lone and level sands. It's not something we as humans think of as a threat. Ozymandias surely didn't. But it's those little grains that literally drown the entire city and its people. It's slow, but unstoppable. The most powerful being in this poem is not Ozymandias, but the sands around him. With this thought in mind, when we read the words that Percy uses to describe the sands, it makes a lot more sense. He calls them boundless, something that could be attributed to a ruler's power. The line "stretch far away" could be talking about a ruler's kingdom. A kingdom that is so big that it stretches out further than the eye can see. Now, remember how I mentioned the traveler's focus on the artist's skill instead of the power of the ruler? Let's talk about that. It's clear that Percy Shelley was not exactly a fan of Ozymandias. It's obvious from the way he describes him. His face stuck in a frown, he had a sneer of cold command, his face shattered, etc, etc. This was because Ozymandias was a tyrant. So Percy Shelley does the most disrespectful thing one can do to any tyrant, not mentioning their accomplishments at all, just treating them like any other guy down the street. The only hint that we get of his power is the traveler saying that his passions are now recorded only on lifeless things, such as the statue. Instead, he praises the artist's eye for detail. I think what Percy Shelley is trying to imply here is that the most enduring thing about humanity is not political power or wealth, but art. Think about it. The traveler, without knowing who the statue was supposed to represent, was still able to discern the king's personality based on the facial expressions on the sculpture and the engraved quote. He says that his passions yet survive, yes, through lifeless things, but he understood what kind of man Ozymandias was. The only reason that we even know that this was Ozymandias and not just another pharaoh was because of the words that were carved onto the stone and not the threat behind it. His legacy, his name, only exists because of a work of art. In a more meta way, the only reason many people in the literary field know about the existence of the pharaoh Ozymandias is because of this poem. This theme of art keeping someone's name alive doesn't just apply to Ozymandias either. The poem also conserves the legacy of Percy himself. See, Ozymandias is Percy Shelley's most famous poem, and he has passed away. The only thing that remains of who he was as a person are his words. Through this poem, Percy Shelley claimed that art is the cure to the decay of legacy, and ultimately, he was proven true. Nearly 200 years after his death, we still remember Percy Shelley through his poems, forever immortalized as one of the greatest poets of all time, even though he was considered a critical and commercial failure when he was writing. And maybe that is what Ozymandias was actually trying to tell us. Thank you for watching and have a beautiful day.